Alexander Lingas, the music director of Capella Romana and its founder, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce this discussion with Father Ivan Moody, the composer of the Greek Liturgy, which will be performed by Capella Romana coming up on the 28th to the 30th of April in Seattle and Portland, and also the guest conductor, Peter Jermihov. So before I get to our discussion, I'd like to just give some brief bios of our two speakers and guests. The Reverend Dr. Ivan Moody studied at the Universities of London, Joensuu, and York. His music has been performed and broadcast all over the world. As a musicologist, he has published widely on the music of the Balkans and the Iberian Peninsula and Orthodox sacred music. He has contributed to Grove, Die Musik in Geschichte und Gegenwart, the Canterbury Dictionary of Hymnology, and the Cambridge Companion to Stravinsky. His book, Modernism and Orthodox Spirituality in Contemporary Music, was published in 2014, and he is currently engaged on a number of research projects dealing with music in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. He is a research fellow at CESEM, the Universidade Nova of Lisbon, and a priest of the Orthodox Church. And then our guest conductor, Peter Jermihov, was born in Chicago of Russian emigre parents. He is thus an American conductor with Russian roots. He came to the St. Petersburg Conservatory as a Fulbright Fellow in the and IREX, the International Research Exchange Scholars of yore, to study orchestral conducting under the legendary master teacher Ilya Musin and to conduct research on the music of Georgy Sviridov. He is active today as a conductor and teacher throughout the world and has recently conducted the Russian premiere of Kurt Sanders' Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom at the Moscow State Conservatory, where he taught master classes in conducting for 2 consecutive years. In July of 2019, he organized the Orthodox Music Masterclass for Composers and Conductors that was held in Chicago. Having served as artistic director of the Patram Institute Singers, a professional chamber choir consisting of singers from across North America, he is the founder and artistic director of the Society of St. Romanos the Melodist, a not-for-profit corporation dedicated to the promotion of Orthodox culture in America. In 2015, he conducted a recording of Rachmaninoff's All-Night Vigil with Gloria Dei Cantores. And in 2017, he conducted a recording of Kurt Sanders' Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom with Patram Institute Singers, which received a 2020 Grammy Award nomination for Best Choral Performance. So we're, again, very excited in Capella Romana at having these two wonderful artists with us, one in terms of being a composer and the other coming to conduct in Seattle and Portland. So bearing all that in mind, I thought I would start with a question for both of you, since you were both involved in the creation of the work that Capella Romana will be performing, the Greek Liturgy. So how did the Greek Liturgy come to be commissioned and written?
I think Peter is in the best position to answer this question. He can detail the circumstances. What I will say is that for me, it was a very welcome commission.
In 2015, I had completed a recording of Rachmaninoff's All-Night Vigil, and I made a resolution for myself that I would devote myself exclusively to newly composed works, that is, works by living composers. So a happy circumstance was that in my parish, where I work as choir director at St. Andrew Church in Chicago, an important parishioner passed away, Archon John Bartholomew, and his wife wanted to provide a lasting memory. And I, at that time, felt that it would be a good idea to approach her to support a commission. And indeed, she responded enthusiastically, and I in turn turned to Father Ivan, and that's how the work came into being. We premiered it at our church during a Divine Liturgy, which was a new experience for me. It was outside of the concert format, but that's how the work came into being.
Wonderful. So this is a question for Father Ivan. This is your second setting of the Divine Liturgy of the Byzantine Rite, the ordinary form of the Eucharist. How does this Greek liturgy differ from your first setting?
That's a very good question. The first setting, which dates from about 1990, I think it was 1989 to 90, is very much experimental. It's trilingual, it's in English, Greek, and Slavonic. And I have to say that at that time I had much less understanding of chant traditions in general than I was subsequently to develop. And even though there was an attempt to work with chant in that piece, it's not what I would now consider integrated. I think it has interesting things in it, but I don't know what I would make of the piece if it were performed as a whole now, let alone in liturgical surroundings. This Greek liturgy is very different because right from the beginning, Peter made it clear to me that it was to be a liturgical setting, and that it should be for a very competent parish choir, not hugely demanding, but not very basic either. So those are the basic differences. And as I said, in the meantime, my understanding of chant traditions in general had developed hugely, and I've worked well, for decades now with chant from Byzantine and Znameni and Serbian traditions particularly. And this has affected the way I actually write. It has affected my melodic writing. And that's true of my instrumental music as well as my choral music. So it really has been a transformative process, this familiarity with chant traditions. Now, that meant that knowing this would be for liturgical use, I really wanted to use chant that would be familiar to people in a Greek parish. So practically everything, melodically speaking, in this liturgy comes from the received Greek tradition. There are some steps outside it, most notably the Kinonikon, the communion hymn, which is actually a version of your transcription, in fact, of St. John Koukouzelis's Anite ton Kyrion. But it's still adjusted so that it could be singable by a modern choir. Even so, that proved to be a little too much for the first performance. I have to say that the video recording that I saw of the first performance within the context of the liturgy, directed by Peter, was absolutely extraordinary, and I was very, very moved by the way he took this piece and the clergy as well. Everyone integrated the piece so well into a normal service, you know, a regular Sunday liturgy, and I was hugely impressed by that. But one thing that was a bit too much was the Kinonikon, which is very long. I am very much in favor of restoring long communion melodies whenever possible. But it doesn't matter, we can do it in different ways, and that's in fact what happened in this case. I believe that in the upcoming performances, the original long version will be done.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely.
So actually, since you've mentioned your sort of the change in your approach, Father Ivan, which is sort of something that it's been my sort of pleasure to follow over the years since we first got to know each other right around the time you wrote that first liturgy, I suppose. You also wrote in some notes associated with this new work that it is your conviction that the contemporary composer of liturgical music for the Orthodox Church must strive to find a way to make his own creative gifts align in some way with the traditions that the Church has given us. If we treat the Church's chant traditions as a life-giving spring, we can find the courage to work with them, to become co-creators. How do both of you understand the Greek liturgy as such a work of co-creation, both from the perspective of the composer and of that of the conductor?
I think Peter ought to answer that first, since I've already spoken for so long.
Thank you. One of the outstanding features of this composition is the balance, I think, between the liturgical function of the music and its artistic elements. And by that, I mean those elements of the composition that function purely in terms of music. I was amazed also, as Father Ivan mentioned, that the entire work fit into the Divine Liturgy, celebrated as a Divine Liturgy, without any suggestion of this being some kind of musically conceived creation outside of the liturgy. It fit totally into the liturgical context. And at the same time, I enjoyed, as a conductor, studying the score purely on musical terms. It's there are contexts where the melodic, where the chant element is treated in very traditional ways, with an Eson. There are contexts in which that becomes more elaborate. You mentioned that communion hymn. Well, of course, the two phrases of that communion hymn are fairly standard, a little bit more elaborate in the sense that the pedal or the Eson gets transferred to other voices. But the Alleluia of that hymn goes into a texture that transcends that very simple monodic and Eson context. It becomes rather elaborate and sophisticated. So there's that element. It doesn't destroy the function of the communion hymn, but it adds this tremendously exciting musical interest. And of course, we have the harmonic element. One of the extraordinary things about this work is that it's able to take, correct me if I'm wrong, Father Ivan, but my sense of how this piece finds unity is the use of melodic pitch content in a verticalization of that, of those pitches in a vertical context. And so the harmonic, purely harmonic sections of this work are just astoundingly beautiful. They still, for instance, utilize the melody, for instance, the Isagios. And so on and so forth. But in Father Ivan's setting, we have this, the melody is still present. You can hear how dissonance is introduced, but it doesn't sound like dissonance. Dissonance acquires a new flavor. It doesn't cut the ear, it relaxes the ear. And it serves as a kind of light bulb moment for the singers. When they introduce a new pitch into the harmonic structure, I would see on the eyes of the singers a kind of lighting up. It wasn't treated and perceived as dissonance. And I think that's a remarkable thing you've accomplished, Father. So overall, you know, the general, there's a stylistic consistency throughout the work, but I think the major achievement is this balance between the spiritual, functional, prayerful aspect of the work with its artistic, paraliturgical elements, with the word you've invented, Father, that combine to produce this very, very beautiful transcendent work.
Well, thank you very much for those words, Peter. I didn't invent the word paraliturgical, by the way. That's been around for a while.
Good.
But I do think you put your finger on what I aim to do, which is, as you expressed it just now, the verticalization of the horizontal. In other words, the melodic intervals within a melodic line, will contribute to the harmonic structure, will form the harmonic structure. In another piece, actually, which I wrote for you, Thy Fatherly Embrace, you pointed out, I hadn't even thought about it, but you pointed out to me that there's one chord right near the end where I have an entire octave in one chord, and I hadn't I hadn't even conceived of this as being dissonant, or it just arose naturally. This is what I mean, I think, by being a co-creator. So you have the musical inheritance of the church, the musical tradition of the church, in other words, the chant, and you have your own possibilities of creation, and you make them. It's not a question of forcing it. It's a kind of natural alignment that arises between what you have and what you can give. And that's it's something I push a bit further out if I'm writing a non-liturgical work. But if we're talking about liturgy, then we really do have constraints, and we have to make sure that we're not writing anything ridiculously out of place, and that it is conducive to prayer, and that it is in harmony, in the broadest possible sense, with what is happening in the liturgical moment, which of course is not necessary in a non-liturgical, in a paraliturgical piece, even such as the Vespers sequence, which I think was the last time I saw you, Peter.
In New York, yes.
Yes, which is based on liturgical text, but is in fact a concert piece, and it was conceived as such. That is not the case with the liturgy. The terms were very clear that it was for liturgical use, so one proceeds in a different way.
Actually, just to follow up on this, though at the same time, I mean, I very much myself studying the score have a strong sense of what Peter mentions, and that in terms of its the care with which you have taken, Father Ivan, in composing this work, that there's musical sort of substance and continuity that allows it also to stand on its own somehow. I mean, in that way, it's a bit like some of the Renaissance polyphony, for example, that we now are used in many cases to hearing either in concerts or sometimes in services as well, if one has a choir that does such things, and that one can sort of appreciate its beauty in both contexts.
Yes, I mean, I didn't at all mean to imply that it couldn't be done in concert. Quite the opposite. But the original aim was for it to be a substantial piece for liturgical use. It's interesting. I must make one further observation here, which is that in Europe, there's hardly any tradition for this kind of thing using the Greek text, as you know very well. In the United States, it's a completely different matter, because you have this whole tradition of polyphonic settings of the liturgy in Greek, and there are some very remarkable examples of this, to Taikis and Peter Michaelidis and so forth. But in Europe, there are examples, but it's such an unusual tradition. The last thing that I'd thought of would be that I would ever write such a piece. I might have done it in Slavonic for a Russian or a Serbian church or something, but I never thought about doing it in Greek. And when Peter asked me about this, in fact, he originally proposed that it be in Greek and English, and I said no, I want it to be all in Greek, because I wanted it to fit somehow. Even though I'm not American, I wanted it to fit within that tradition so that people would know what they had. And I really do hope that other choirs will take it up and use it liturgically.
Actually, that is a very interesting point that you've made, because it's yes, in terms of sort of European examples, that one has to look mostly to the early 20th century, the works of people like Emilios Riadis or Spiros Pathis and some of them. And there have been a few cases in more recent years, the work of the late Michael Adamis, writing for the Palace Choir when it still existed at when Greece had a functioning monarchy. And sort of, but there aren't that many other examples. So yes, it's very interesting again that you've made that link to particularly the Greek American experience, which again sort of started at the same place where people were in the 1920s and 30s, and then has had its own independent life as an artistic and liturgical tradition. So Peter, from your perspective as a conductor, what particular demands does the Greek liturgy place on you as a director and on the singers?
This touches in a somewhat threatening way on the extent to which this work can be indeed performed in the context of an average church choir, whether it be in America or in other places. For this piece to function optimally, in my opinion, it has to be in tune. And when it is in tune, all of these marvelous harmonic textures emerge in a magnificent way. They use the acoustics and of course the overtones click in. I found that to be, I was fortunate to work in our premiere with wonderful professional singers, and we did not have serious intonation problems, but that was a determining factor. When the intonation wasn't quite up to par, we lost sense of that kind of luminous transcendent quality of the harmonic structures. But another thing, and you of course, Dr. Lingas, you'd have a much better sense of this being a specialist in Byzantine music, but I wanted to introduce into the chant renditions the melodic beauty of them, and particularly with regard to phrasing, so that you could have, you know, a chant that in a kind of plodding, pulse-oriented way, or it's there's such a wonderful almost turning to the listener, turning to God in the worship context. The phrasing is so important, and I was working on that very intentfully. And finally, something I mentioned earlier is that when these so-called dissonant pitches emerge, that they be emerged with a sense of what the Russians call intoning, that a pitch doesn't appear just as, let's say, if you have the note C and all of a sudden the note G appears. It's not just a kind of abstract major second, but that it appears in the context of the melody that may be in the leading voice, and that in the context of the pedal, so that the emergence of the added note becomes a sonically significant event. And those things kind of emerge in the process of rehearsing. They were tremendously satisfying to rehearse, but they were also, in a sense, challenges that I set forth at the outset.
So how do you see these demands then relating to Cappella Romana? So you're bringing this work, which you premiered in Chicago, now to Cappella Romana, and how does all that going to work together?
Well, it's a great honor for me to be working with the premier Byzantine choir, I'd say, in the world now. Um, in our rendition in Chicago in 2017, I believe it was, we of course had no Greeks in the choir. They're marvelous singers, really world-class singers. It's amazing. The pool of professional singers in Chicago is outstanding. I was very pleased with the outcome given the circumstances, but I'm so excited to bring. There are a few singers from that performance being exported to Portland, and I'm delighted about that. But I'm so excited to bring a kind of musical professionalism and all the attention and care that a professional singer can bring with the expertise of the singers in the Capella Romana. I think that combination is going to be wonderful, and particularly with the diction elements and some of this phrasing that I was talking about just recently as we were compiling the score for the singers. Father Ivan, you listed your doxa patris in a traditional recitative notation, and I took it upon myself to write out the actual rhythms so that we don't spend time over rehearsing that. But I think some of these things, like the singing of doxa patri, will be natural, automatic. We won't have to talk about it. It'll just happen on its own. And another element that is of interest and concern to me is the tone quality. The Eson produces marvelous overtones, and in my rather distant connection to Byzantine chant, I experienced ethos, the ethos of the Eson experience on Mount Athos at the Vatapedi Monastery, and I recall being absolutely shocked and transformed by the strength of the Eson, and it's the power of that. And the melody was not the focal point. The if you will, the spiritual core of the performance was the Eson. It provided that sense of centeredness in the logos, and the melody was, bluntly speaking, a kind of human elaboration of that. And I'm looking forward to finding that kind of balance in our upcoming performances, where the pedal notes are not separated from melodic elements, but become completely integrated. And I think, again, with the expertise of the singers of Capella Romana, I think that's going to be very possible.
Actually, you remind me of some experience just this last week in Holy Week, where I went and for a Holy Thursday evening for the Passion service, I was singing mostly Eson because I was a guest, and they were singing with some wonderful local cantors. And again, just that I think that people who come from outside the tradition are sometimes sort of unaware of just how important it is, and the amount of focus, and how all that the melody, it just is harmonically an outgrowth. It's a kind of natural extension of this. And I think, Father, that you've composed this work, and as you say, even the additional notes besides the Eson that emerge in your textures are likewise logical consequences of that core.
Yeah, I often talk about an expanded Eson, so that you start from one note and then you reinforce it according to the melody. So you reinforce those moments when the melody moves. I'm not talking about what our late and much missed friend Lycurgos Angelopoulos would have called bouncing Esons. But on the contrary, in fact, it's something that's very stable, but has additional layers which reinforce different areas of the mode in which the melody may be, and then comes back down again, or even moves. But it only moves when it's absolutely the right thing to do. It's not just following in a kind of mechanical 18th century contrapuntal way what the melody is doing.
Indeed. So with regard to this work, it's going to be now performed in Portland and Seattle. And what are your hopes for it next?
Is this for both
Who's
of you?
the question
For
directed
both of you,
to?
for both of you. Yes, where would you like to
Oh.
see it? Well, you know, it's so it had an original liturgical premiere, and now it's being done with specialist singers from Cappella Romana who are used to the idioms and the Greek style and text and so on. What would you like to see happen next?
Well, I don't know about Peter, but I would like to see it, as I hinted before, I would like to see it taken up by other polyphonic liturgical choirs, and why not concert choirs, who have some connection with this kind of repertoire. Let's see if that happens. I certainly think that performances by Cappella will encourage people to to hear it in a different way, in the best possible light, if you can hear in a light.
Indeed. Dr. Jermihov?
Yes, I would like to see this work performed in many, many contexts and appreciated for all its merits. But in my aging, cynical mind, I like to think that it's very important to record composition. It's very important to leave it as a testament to the times. I would very much love to record this work in some of the ways we've talked about in the past, but we'd have to, of course, talk about all the logistics of that and whatnot. But I would love to do this recording with somewhat of an expanded choir, only because I'd like to exploit some of these harmonic elements, and also because in certain of these hymns, the more sophisticated choral hymns, such as the cherubic hymn or the anaphora or the mechalinarion, there's just more of an unfolding of the texture that I think would benefit for a slightly larger choir. And also that in the cherubic hymn, for instance, those slow, sustained soprano lines are extremely difficult. I'm excited to the fact that you invited Alex Olsovsky from Chicago. She's just a marvelous singer who sang in the first performance, who can render that. But I think the leaving of that for posterity, leaving some kind of mark for others to refer to. I just finished reading an article about Stravinsky and the discrepancy between his expectations for tempos and through his metronome markings and the actual tempos that he took performing the works. And you get this marvelous dialogue about, well, what did he really want? And you know, it's just wonderful to come back to a piece of music, let's say in 25 years, and have a sense of how this was done with the composer's input and such an outstanding choir. So that's my dream.
Well, thank you both so much for this this illuminating conversation. Once again, that looking forward to the performances by Cappella Romana of Father Ivan Moody's Greek Liturgy, his setting of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, to be performed in Seattle on the 28th of April at St. James Cathedral, and then in Portland on the Saturday, the 29th of April at St. Mary's Cathedral, and Sunday, the 30th of April at the Madeleine Parish, both in Portland, Oregon. Thank you very much.